So now I think I'm going to talk about gravity. Um, let's see. So if you take, say, Jupiter and Europa, one of its moons, and most people know that um, it gets closer and farther away, or they get closer and farther away from each other. I think they call that the perihelion and the whatever, the one that starts with an A. And so as they come closer together, we hear about what they call tidal forces, and it basically stretches Europa. And then as it moves farther away from Jupiter, then it gets less stretched in that direction. So what's left out of this picture, because the left brain is fragmented and theoretical science is fragmented, is that Jupiter also stretches. That it's actually, you can imagine it as one thing, and as they get closer, they're both stretching, and as they get farther apart, they get less stretched. It's just that we ignore the stretching of Jupiter because it's you can't really detect it. It's so small, and it's because Jupiter is so much bigger than Europa, and then you can visualize an equation without any constants. So you take the mass of Jupiter times its degree of stretching, and that should equal the degree of stretching of Europa times its mass, compensating for differences in composition and other factors. And that's interesting because it resembles Newton's second law, or Newton's third, one of his laws. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, or basically, if you have a bigger person and a smaller person, say they're running about the same speed and they run into each other, obviously the bigger person is going to distribute more energy to the smaller person than the small person is going to distribute to the big person, and so he's going to be all hurt, more hurt than the bigger person. And that's the same kind of relationship. It's just mass times the acceleration, the mass of the big person times its change in, I think change is the best word, not really acceleration. There's more change done to the smaller person than the big person in relation to their relative mass, just in the way I was talking about the planets. It's hard to kind of visualize that. It's easier to visualize the planets. But they both have this sort of yin and yang kind of relationship. But my point about that is the fact that they resemble each other hints that there's a connection between the two. And we talk about Newton's third law in terms of like a collision, right? Even though all but when you look at Io Europa and Jupiter, it's really, you can think of it as a collision at a distance, because the terminology that Einstein and Newton used to use was action at a distance. Newton didn't like action at a distance, whereas Einstein invented the medium in between to try to get rid of the distance or the gap. I want to get to that, but let me explain this first thing first. So one's an ordinary collision and the other one's a collision at a distance, even though ordinary collision is still at a distance, like there's still a gap. Nothing's actually really touching, and there really are no atoms or even stick figures. The only thing that we can visualize, or with a microscope, the strongest light microscope, is like structures in the cell. We don't actually see the individual molecules We can only do that with scattering electron, or scattering a bunch of electrons, and it builds up a pattern. So I like to call that symbolic matter. Like atoms are symbolic matter. Electrons and protons are symbolic masses. And the stick figure molecules, those are symbolic relations. And what I mean by that is they don't exist like a macroscopic object. Only the perturbations are real. The perturbations in the detector. And the detector is not outside the system, meaning like we have to detect the detector too. That's still only perturbations. I'm saying all there are perturbations. Yeah, basically, I know that sounds weird. I'm saying that everything that we built up on this macroscopic level is really just all composed of perturbations, which aren't composed of anything at all. That's the key, is that it's not composed of anything at all. And that's really trippy to people. And just like how they're trying to fill the gap between planets by inventing a medium, you can see a Zeno-like paradox where if you try to fill the gap, you just leave a smaller gap when you zoom in. And then you could try to fill the gap again with like a graviton, and it's just going to leave a smaller gap. Well, the same kind of problem happens when you think of the atom as a macroscopic object, and then it has structure, and then you can keep on zooming in, you see. And then you have a problem with like exchange of energy, because anything that gets absorbed has to get absorbed into the, if the electron was a sphere, a macroscopically imaginable sphere, the photon would have to be absorbed into the sphere, but before that it would have to be absorbed within a metasphere within the sphere, but before that it would have to be absorbed into the metasphere within the sphere, and so basically absorption could never take place. And you have a Zeno-like paradox for any kind of like atom macroscopic picture on the microscopic world, or the astronomical scale. If you try to invent a medium and place it in between the presence and eliminate absence by filling it with presence, you're going to get that same Zeno-like paradox, especially even in the medium itself. Because once you say the medium can bend or contract, then you've admitted that it has an internal structure, and then it's going to create that Zeno paradox if the structure ever ends. Or if the structure doesn't end, like I'm talking about. So, what was my point about that? That's a lot about, I'm trying to see Joe Rogan and people like that, they're right on the verge of like grasping that everything is nonsense that people talk about. That they just have this idea from talking to Graham Hancock, they're starting to get the idea that academia is just kind of like the McDonald's of thought. But they think it's sort of like these are just little isolated cases where people are just full of shit. But it's really that everyone's full of shit. Like Brian Cox, Stephen Hawking, everyone. They're just all trying to fill these gaps and not worrying about Zeno's paradox or anything like that. They're thinking in terms of how. They're not really thinking about the details of things. They're not very rigorous. So, yeah, no one knows what they're really talking about. If you could just sit them down and like probe the meaning of their words, they would just get tangled up and then get frustrated and not talk to you anymore, because they don't have to talk to you, they have power. The idea where Joe Rogan is not seeing that it's all bullshit, like it's not just isolated cases of bullshit, is similar to how people think of racism, where they think that these crazy racist acts happen and they see, oh, it's just like an isolated little thing. It's not an isolated little thing. But that allows people to go back to their everyday lives and not worry about anything and not have to think about it. And they don't have to think everything's crazy and lame. One of the clues for Joe Rogan should be is that they're not really into psychedelics and they're like afraid of them. Like you talk to these people, like Mikao Kaku went on his podcast. Yeah. Because if these physicists actually took LSD, for example, or mushrooms, they might notice, for example, that like their body movements are discontinuous. So you can really feel your body on some of these psychedelics where you can see that if your body motion was continuous, then it couldn't exist at all. You couldn't have an experience. It's like you need that jump to compare before and after in order to have experience at all. And that's something that's trippy that you noticed on psychedelics. Another one is they might notice that when, like on acid, like if you move your hand, you can see like all the stills stacked one after the other, like instead of a blur. And so you can see there's really no such thing as motion even in vision, let alone the actual world. Well, I don't mean there's no change. I'm saying that the way things change in the world, there has to be discrete steps. Meaning, otherwise you have Zeno's paradox again. It doesn't mean that the bottom has to be precise steps. Because there's nothing precise in nature. So usually people talk in terms of what's called the Planck length, and that's like a minimum limit. They've rearranged a bunch of constants and popped out like a minimum length. But that doesn't mean that it's like it jumps at that minimum length. It's just saying there's a limit to detail. And there has to be just jumps. It doesn't have to be the same jump every time, and it's extremely small, but there's actually no continuous flow. The continuity itself is not imaginable, if that makes any sense. So there's this, you can't get rid of the gaps. The gaps are required for there to be anything at all. And so that's something you can learn on psychedelics. I also had a shared hallucination once where I projected a fluid out in front of me, and I could tap it and make ripples, and the girl that was with me could see the fluid. So it's like she was projecting the fluid too, and she could hit it and ripple, and then we could create an interference pattern. And so that's another example of non-locality. It's like our minds were sharing a hallucination, or I don't know. You can also say, like, you're coming down from mushrooms, you can go to a coffee shop and you can see all the muscle twitches basically in people's faces, and so you could see all their little insecurities. Or if you're driving home, you could almost see like all their agitation, and more than that. It doesn't seem like you could see more, but you could see more just from like how fast they hit their brake and the shake in their bumper. It feels like you could read like stuff into like their psyche, you know. It's pretty trippy. And one time, like when I was 23, this is a long time ago, before I started thinking about a bunch of stuff, and it showed me these memories in sequence, like where I would be like thinking about stuff like why this, that's interesting, and then show me getting bogged down by something bureaucratic like schoolwork or something, and then it would show me go back to it and go why, and then get bogged down again, and it showed me like 5 or 6 instances of these memories that I didn't remember on my own. And then I had this epiphany. I was like, oh, I can't stop until I figure out why everything is happening. And then I got out of the bed and I went into the bathroom, and this sort of like field shot out of my hands, and it was connected to the walls, and the lights were like kind of pulsing, and there was a whoom sound, and yeah, that was crazy, and I felt like I could feel the walls from far away with the field that was connecting the two. And I forgot what happened after that, because I don't know. But also little things you'll notice, like you'll have a sensation like you have to urinate, and your body will start turning around before it even occurs to you linguistically in your head. You'll say like pee in your head, but your body's already turning around in the direction of the bathroom, which doesn't